Let's dive into orchestral composition. I suggest that you compose a piano sketch first, sort out the structure of the track, and then flesh it out at the orchestration stage. There will be times when you're just inspired and start your composition from a string melody or brass or percussion. But in most cases, you can just lay out a simple piano sketch with the bass line, the top melody, and perhaps some information about the chords that you want to use. Something like this, for example. Then you can work on the structure of the piece and make sure that you're reasonably happy with it before moving to the next step. The structure could be anything from a simple build-up, where you have a core module and keep adding things to it, to a 15-minute symphony with anything in between. So I know this can be overwhelming, but this is the specific stage where you're building a house of cards, and you can bring it down, then do it from scratch until you're satisfied with the structure of the tune. Make sure one section flows into the next one. Start by figuring out the desired length of the track. A lot of cinematic music these days is between 90 and 150 seconds. So you can start from something as simple as an intro, a section A, and then a variation of section A or a section B. Remember that section A and B can also be alternated, and perhaps AB-AB is one of the simplest structures that you're gonna find in music, both instrumental and non. Last but not least, you can take any track that you like as a reference, write down the structure, and then use it as a scaffold for your work. At the end of this module, you'll find a breakdown of Shadow Era main theme that will help you identify the different structural elements in a track, so you can apply the same analytic approach to any music. There are many harmonic implants that you can use as a hosting network for your melodies and chord progressions. Let's start with some of the common modes in modern orchestral composition. The Aeolian mode goes from A to A using only white keys. And it's also known as the scale of A minor natural in tonal harmony. The Dorian mode goes from D to D using only white keys. There are 7 main modes, but we'll focus on these 2 for now. What's important is that you can transpose each mode to any key, because what defines the mode are the relationships between the notes. For example, the only difference between Dorian and Aeolian is that Dorian has a major submediant. So if you want to play A Dorian, all you have to do is to put an F sharp in it. And I encourage you to familiarize with these 2 modes because they're commonly used and often alternated in modern epic music. How do you actually use this to build one of the segments that are going to fit into the structure of the tune? You can start from the melody, you can start from the bass line, or you can figure them out simultaneously. But obviously, this is an academic example, and the magic ingredient that is gonna make things work is your imagination. You can play with combinations. Basically, any combination of keys can be a melody as long as you stay within the mode. And any combination of 4 notes can be the starting point for a chord progression. Of course, the chord progression can be more than 4 chords, and you can also combine multiple modes, as I said earlier. This is just a starting point. The possibilities are endless, and I don't want you to feel limited in any way. I want you to remind yourself of the possibility of contrary motion, which means that when the bass goes down, the melody goes up, and vice versa. Contrary motion is a very useful concept, and it can be applied to other stages of the arrangement too. Now, in regard to the chords, start working with triads, which are combinations of 3 notes stacked in thirds. And use them in conjunction with the bass and the melody. You can use chord inversions. A chord inversion means that the lowest note you play is no longer the root note of the triad, but rather the third or the fifth. You can avoid moving all parts in parallel all the time. So instead of you can have this. Both solutions can be valid and work well for different situations. In the first example I played to you, you can hear these concepts working together. As I said in the beginning of this module, you can transpose all the structures we examined to any key. I am just sticking to Aeolian and Dorian because it's visually easier and it's going to help you visualize these things on a keyboard. But I am not in any way, shape or form suggesting that you should only write music in Aeolian. I also encourage you to explore tonal harmony, which uses primarily the major scale, the melodic minor scale, and the harmonic minor scale. And I invite you to experiment with all the other modal scales too. Going into much detail is outside the scope of this course, but I want you to know that each mode has a specific flavor to it, and it's gonna come in handy at some point. The Lydian mode sounds dreamy, but can also be quirky and uplifting. The Mixolydian is pensive and bold. Lydian and Mixolydian only differ from the major scale for one note. Lydian has a raised fourth and Mixolydian has a lowered seventh. Because of this, they can be alternated with the major scale, even inside the same melody. You can use dissonance to spice up your compositions. Now, what's dissonance? You can look it up and you will find a number of different theories around the concept of consonance and dissonance, depending on the century and the context where such theories were written. Most people identify the concept of consonance with pleasantness. Take the following intervals, for example. Whereas people identify the concept of dissonance with harshness. Clearly, there's a lot of subjectivity to this, but for practical reasons, we're going to say that what we examined in the first part of this module sounded comforting to the ears of many, and now we're going to talk about solutions that are commonly perceived as more strident. I want you to memorize two core principles. How dissonance is perceived is affected by the positioning of the notes. The same notes, C and D flat, when played together, will sound different depending on the octaves. So if you want this dissonance to be more obvious, you'll bring them closer. Otherwise, you're going to spread them more. How dissonance is perceived is also affected by the context. So if you take the same minor ninth C and D flat on its own with no preparation and no resolution, it will sound really strident. Whereas if you put it in context, it's gonna make more sense. Therefore, you can gauge this aspect as well, depending on how hard you'd like the dissonance in question to hit. The following example uses a diminished fifth, also known as a tritone, which is historically considered a very dissonant interval. There are a number of modulations, also known as key changes, that sound dissonant or surprising and are often used in cinematic composition. Modulating by a tritone, from major to major, from minor to minor, from minor to major, and from major to minor. As you can hear, some of these sound more jarring than others. Major to major sounds actually grandiose, but nonetheless surprising. Minor to minor sounds really dark, especially in the lower range. Chromatic mediant modulations. These are very common in film music, super effective and easy to implement. Bear with me for the theory because it sounds complicated, but it isn't. There are 12 chromatic mediant modulations. From any given key, you can go up or down by a minor third or by a major third, and you can combine all the triads from minor to minor, major to major, and so on. So in theory, you'd end up with 16 combinations. But 4 are not modulations, so you're left with 12 of them. I invite you to experiment with these. The ones I personally tend to use the most are minor to minor going down by a major third, and minor to minor going up by a minor third. These modulations are the embodiment of tension, and they lend themselves to melodic development. Modulating by a semitone. You can also change key quite abruptly by going up or down by a semitone. We'll just stick to the minor mode for now. These modulations are interesting because they're almost always going to sound quite dissonant. They lend themselves to somber atmospheres. You can use them to build the darkest melodies. An interesting variation is when you start with a minor triad, then go down by a semitone and land on a major triad. It sounds very cinematic, and it lends itself to action track with dark undertones. Experiment with these three things we've just analyzed: modulating by a tritone, by a semitone, and chromatic mediant. Learn what they do for you and alternate them with the more consonant chord progression. The secret is to use these modulations strategically for dramatic effect. Up to now, we stayed within the boundaries of tonality and modality. Yes, we did move more or less abruptly between keys and created dissonant harmonies, but the individual melodies that we examined always followed a tonal or modal scale. I want to introduce you to two atonal scales that can be useful when you're trying to achieve a different sound: the hexatonic scale and the octatonic scale. Let me show you how they sound. What's so special about these two, and why are they useful? Modal scales and tonal scales always have their own center of gravity. In a tonal context, it's even more apparent because the dominant acts as a polar opposite, and the chords we build on the fifth are the apex of tension, so they need to be resolved. With hexatonic and octatonic, on the other hand, the scale is perfectly symmetrical, so there's no center of gravity, and these scales allow you to create evocative atmospheres. The hexatonic scale is made of 6 whole tones, so there's 2 of them. As you can see, we've already used up all the 12 semitones, so that's it. The scale contains 3 tritones. And the chords that it creates are all augmented triads. Hexatonic music sounds quite open, but at the same time mysterious. The octatonic scale is even more interesting and versatile. It's made of tones and semitones alternated. So if you check all the possible combinations, there's only 3 of them. It lends itself to a variety of scenarios, from quirky to ominous, and it's been used in film music throughout the 80s and 90s. The octatonic combinations when it comes to orchestration are endless. Because there's no tonal center, therefore you can truly move the parts freely. This scale does actually contain a sequence of tritones and chromatic medians. But in this context, all the notes belong to the same scale, and this allows you to write melodies that wouldn't be possible otherwise. If you alternate the Lydian mode with an octatonic scale, you get something like this. Very quirky. I genuinely invite you to experiment with this scale, and even if you're not going to use it all the time, I encourage you to write a 30 to 60 second piece of octatonic music as an exercise. I promise that it will surprise you. All you have to do is pick one of the 3 octatonic scales from this diagram and write music that only uses notes from that scale. The bass line, the melody, the chords, all octatonic. I want to provide you with a few famous examples of the scales and ideas that we examined up to now. You can find them very easily on the internet, so I'm just giving you the names in order to avoid any copyright issues. An ostinato is a phrase or a pattern that is repeated and provides a foundation to everything else. You can change everything around it, creating lots of different combinations. You can move the bass, you can of course add chords, and or other melodies. You can also modify the actual ostinato without losing the feeling of having an ostinato. Ostinatos are great for minimalistic cinematic compositions. Let's now have a look at what writing a piano sketch might look like. Let's say you have this simple A Aeolian melody. And you know that you want to put 6, 4, 1, 3 underneath like this. You could start with a brief introduction that uses notes from the chords above. And then present the melody like this. you could then derive variations from that main melody. And you might even add a pattern to create movement. By the way, I know that this looks unrealistic from a piano perspective, but in this case I'm not composing for piano. I'm writing a piano sketch for something that will be arranged for ensemble later on. So going back to our sketch, you can then insert a quiet variation based on the same chord progression. And then come back with the main melody in a different key. Of course, this is just an example. Every choice you make, from the scales that you pick to the chord progressions, the tempo, the time signature, the rhythm, and the structure, will shape your music entirely. Writing music in general requires lots of practice, so don't be afraid to write sketches and experiment with ideas. If they don't work, you just discard them and move on to the next idea until you find the right one. Sometimes you have to stick to an idea for a bit longer before it shows its true potential. Also, making that call, whether an idea is worth developing or should be discarded, requires experience as well. So please be patient and give yourself the time to learn, especially if you're new to writing orchestral music. One of the perks of music composition is that the possibilities are endless, but too much freedom can be a limiting factor sometimes, because we could just sit there contemplating all the options without making a move. Rules help with this, because they force us to act within a certain scheme. Now, it doesn't matter if we stick to the old rules of music composition or create new ones. We are totally free to make our own, of course. The point is that your own sound as a composer is determined by your decisions, both conscious and unconscious, by the scales that you use, the harmonies, whether you opt for a minimalistic development with a chord structure that changes over time, or you have identifiable segments in your music like A, B, and so on. Plus the arrangement, the instrumentation, and the production, all these things shape the sound of your music. Also, it's perfectly normal to be influenced by the music we love. And last but not least, it is important to push the envelope by trying things that we haven't tried before, using that scale that we never used, or writing something super simple with just 2 instruments, or super complex with as many as we can think of, using odd time signatures, borrowing from other genres, and so on. To summarize this module, be intentional about the structure of your track. Play with the structure at an early stage, possibly writing a piano sketch before you start orchestrating. Analyze your favorite music and try to figure out what other composers do in terms of structural development. Think about the scales that you're using. If you're inspired and a new melody simply comes to you, that's fantastic. But then look back and analyze what you did, because from the scale or the scales that you've picked is going to derive the harmonic implant, which will affect the structure, the arrangement, everything. Also, be deliberate about how you use consonants and dissonance. Remember that the modes or certain scales have a specific vibe to them, so think of how that works in relation to the message that you're trying to communicate. You can jump between tonalities if you like, or even step outside the boundaries of tonality. Dissonance and tension in general are powerful tools that can help you convey emotions and make your music more impactful.